كلية الفقه الحنفي تقدم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعده. So now for today's session, inshallah, we will be continuing with the discussion that Ibn Abidin was having in regards to this statement that the Usuliyun made, that can you have two opposing opinions from a mujtahid? So now he's going to carry on through different quotes, different discussions to try to disprove that and to show that that is not true. So he'll go on to explain various things here. There are certain things over here that are interesting, so we will go through these discussions rather than skipping them, because I think there are certain things in there that are needed to be understood, and certain important questions as well that he raises. That there is this famous quote from Imam Abu Hanifa to telling his students that in tawajjaha lakum dalilun faqulu bihi, that if a particular evidence becomes settles in your heart, and you want to go with that evidence because that evidence according to you is stronger, then you say according to that, meaning you can go according to that opinion based on that evidence of yours. So what does this mean? What does this particular statement mean? How much remit is there here then? Does this allow the students to then go against Imam Abu Hanifa? So we'll talk about that, rahimahullah. And there is a very interesting discussion here regarding what the students of Imam Abu Hanifa mention in regards to the various opinions. We'll discuss regarding how Imam Sahib would conduct his discussions or his lessons. We'll talk about that. There is an important question here that if we are giving a ruling against Imam Sahib's opinion, then how are we still Hanafis? So how are you still a follower of Imam Abu Hanifa when you've given a fatwa, when you are following a ruling of, for example, Imam Abu Yusuf or Imam Muhammad? So that will be discussed. Then there is a famous quote from Imam Sahib: إذا صح الحديث فهو مذهبي. When a hadith is correct, valid, verified, then that's my madhab. So what does that mean? Does it allow anybody to then say that this particular hadith is sahih, therefore that's also part of the Hanafi school? So we will discuss that. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So now, moving on to continue this section, Ibn Abidin here is really coming down on the Usuliyun, the scholars of Usul who initially he mentioned from, stating that a mujtahid cannot have two opposing opinions attributed to him. So he went through various reasons as to why this can be the case, that a mujtahid can have two different opposing opinions mentioned that are attributed to him. And then he's just furthering this. He's going on and just really expounding upon this. I want to just try to wrap this discussion up so that this doesn't extend, because this doesn't really help us too much in terms of understanding the usulul ifta, but obviously it is somewhat useful. There are certain things in there that are useful that we want to go through, inshallah. So firstly, he mentions from Imam Qarafi saying that it won't be permissible to give a ruling, it won't be permissible to give a fatwa or to rule in accordance to a opinion which is not the preponderant opinion of the mujtahid, unless the evidences conflict from the mujtahid, and there is no capacity to be able to preponderate. There's no way that a preponderance can be made. So now he says that then ruling on whichever one a person wishes, that's then permissible. So because according to that person, according to the person who's ruling, both opinions are equal. So you can't give preference to this one over the other one. So you can rule in accordance to whichever one you think is suitable in accordance to that particular case. So anyway, he uses this also, a quote from Allama Qarafi, to show that this clearly shows that a mujtahid can have two opposing opinions attributed to him. And so that he mentions this first, and then he does mention, however, that yes, obviously, if we can prove that one of the opinions the mujtahid retracted from, he no longer held that position, then it will not be correct to attribute that opinion to the mujtahid. Because once the mujtahid has retracted from that opinion, it no longer remains to be his opinion. Then he goes on to mention, actually he mentions here something quite coming back to the initial evidences. He says that if there are conflicting evidences, so in essence there are two verses of the Quran, they are conflicting, seemingly conflicting, then you will return to the hadith. So go to the hadith, which is the next source of evidence, as we know. Now, if the evidence from the hadith doesn't give you anything, or that it still conflicts even when there is the hadith there, then you will go to the opinions of the Sahaba radiallahu anhum. You go to their opinions. And if that still remains vague or is still conflicting, then you will go to qiyas, you go to analogy. And then after going to analogy, if still there is a conflict because there's analogy which also contradicts each other, then you have to do a taharri, you have to make a educated guess in essence, and then do amal on whatever your heart then settles upon. Now, obviously, this is for a person who is capable of doing this, in essence, reaches a level of ijtihad for the person to be able to do this. This is not an address to any person, because not everyone will be able to do this. Now, he uses this to show that this then shows that there can be two opposing opinions from a particular a mujtahid. Why? Because this can actually happen, what we just presented. So obviously this can happen, perhaps, he says that sometimes we don't know what the final opinion of the mujtahid was. So he's mentioning same sort of things that we've just discussed previously anyway. So all of this, he says, in refutation of what the scholars of usul mentioned. Then he goes on to mention that sometimes, because Imam Sahib, because of his intense precaution and his level of taqwa, and also because of his knowledge, him knowing that a difference of opinion, it creates the effects of it, that it will valid difference of opinion within the boundaries of remit of ikhtilaf, how a difference of opinion is meant to be dealt with. This kind of a difference of opinion will create rahmah, will create ease for the ummah. So because obviously it creates scope. When there is a valid difference of opinion, it creates scope. So for example, just to make you understand this, because a lot of people get confused on this. So a practical example of this, so like a person let's say, is going to be sitting in an examination. So they're going to be sitting in examination. That exam lasts perhaps 2 hours, 3 hours, as obviously higher, education exams could last. So if an examination is going to last that long, and the person is going to go into the examination room, the examination hall, before the Asr time, for example, starts, the Mithlain time for Imam Sahib starts, and they will come out when well into Maghrib time. So they will miss their Asr prayer. They will miss their Asr prayer now, because they're going to be in exam room and they're not going to be allowed out to go pray. So now what does that person do? So now, because there is an ikhtilaf within the madhab, where we have Sahibain holding the opinion that mithl, one times the shadow, starts Asr. So this person on this day make sure that they've prayed their dhuhr before that mithl time, and they're going to pray now, because they're still outside, the exam hasn't started yet. When the mithl happens, when the one time shadow happens, they can pray the Asr at that time, and then obviously go into the exam hall. That in that way, they will be able to pray the Asr now, isn't it? So this ikhtilaf, this difference of opinion, created this rahmah for this person in this particular scenario. Obviously, it applies to this person in this scenario. I'm sure we can understand many other masail will be like this, where the ikhtilaf, the difference of opinion, creates a bit of leeway now, room for maneuvering, as we would say. So this is what we're referring to here, that Ibn Abidin's mentioning that Imam Sahib, because of his knowledge of this, he would say to his students, he would say to them, if a evidence becomes, comes to light for you, evidence means from Quran, from Hadith, comes to light for you, then you say, you go according to that. If something really settles in your heart in accordance to some evidence that, no, this evidence makes sense, then you go according to that, no problem. Meaning that you are free to oppose my opinion, Imam Sahib in essence is saying, if a evidence makes more sense to you, contrary. So this is famous from Imam Sahib, that he would say this to his students. And as a result, the way Imam Sahib would discuss the rulings, the masail with his students would be that he wouldn't just be telling them like many other teachers would teach, like just dictating to them like a lecturer, dictate to them the opinions. He would hold a discussion. So he would prompt them to speak. He would prompt them to give an opinion. And if he felt as though they're not thinking the way he wants them to think, in an ijtihadi way, so then he would oppose them, right? He would play the advocate on the other side. He would oppose them, saying that, okay, you agree with this opinion, yeah? And they would say, yes, we agree with this opinion. So then what he would do, he would give an opposing opinion, and he'll say, what about this opinion? They would say, no, we don't agree with that. So then he would evidence that opposing opinion, and would evidence it so much that many of them would get convinced that, actually, you're right, this makes sense. So then what would happen, after he says to them that you agree with this second opinion, yes? And they would say, yes, we agree with this opinion. Then he would say, okay, I'll give you a third opinion. So he gives a third opinion, completely apart from the first and the second opinion. I would give that opinion. They would say, no, we don't agree with that, X, Y, Z. And then he would say, okay, and then he'll evidence that. He'll give evidences for that third opinion, and it would convince many of them that, oh yeah, actually, I agree with this opinion. And then he would come back to the first opinion, and he'd say, actually, that first opinion we talked about, he'd evidence that now. And so many of them would be like, oh, Imam Sahib, you confused us. You've taken us round the whole block. Yeah, you've taken us here to here to here, and we were right all along. So the point of Imam Sahib doing this exercise with them was to try to get them to think out of the box. Think, look at this, look at that, look at this, look at different perspectives. Once you've thought of all the different perspectives, then you are in a better position to be able to decide that this is the one I think is more correct based on this reason or that reason. So this is how Imam Sahib would have his discussions with his students, and he would prompt discussion in this way. So now we understand how Imam Abu Hanifa's gatherings were, his durus, his giving of his lessons, how he would do it, how he would conduct it, Imam Abu Yusuf rahmatullahi alayhi is quoted to have said in the Walwalijiyah, in Kitab al-Jinayat, Ibn Abidin is quoting from saying that Imam Abu Yusuf says that I do not say anything, any opinion which I contradict Imam Abu Hanifa in, except that it was an opinion of Imam Sab that he held. So we can see here that it must have sourced from Imam Sab an opinion that Imam Abu Yusuf rahmatullahi holds today, for example, right? Likewise, Imam Zufr is quoted to have said something very similar, that I have not contradicted Imam Abu Hanifa in anything except that he said it, but then he retracted from that. So he did say it, but he retracted from that opinion. But obviously Imam Zufr still held that opinion because of this statement that Imam Sab mentioned to the students, that if you consider a evidence to be stronger or something, then you're fine to go with that. So this is the way, like this is in Hawi al-Qudsi, he mentions as well. A similar thing has been narrated from, or has been transmitted from all the senior students of Imam Abu Hanifa, the likes of Imam Muhammad, Imam, like we talked about, Zufar, Imam Hassan ibn Ziyad as well. They all say, with taking oath, they take oaths on it as well, saying that we don't say any opinion except that it was a transmission from Imam Abu Hanifa. Now, obviously, some people have lately questioned this, that was it actually an opinion from Imam Saab and the rest of it, right? But when we realize and we come to know that this is the way Imam Saab would have a discussion, then perhaps it was something which was sourced from Imam Abu Hanifa, and the student, he obviously furthered that opinion in terms of adopting it and then evidencing it further, maybe strengthening the evidences that back this particular opinion. And then obviously that's why that opinion was then attributed to that particular student of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. So here again, he is trying to mention how a mujtahid can have multiple opinions. Going back to that discussion of the original one that we started with, that the usuliyun, they mentioned that you can't have two opposing opinions. So you can see he's got a real gripe with what they have mentioned and he's going on about it. But in this discussion, we have this very interesting way of understanding how Imam Sab would have his discussions. So this was very interesting. Another thing he also brings up now is that there is a question now to be posed here, that in the Hanafi school, how come we are giving fatwa, we are giving ruling, a preponderating an opinion which is contrary to the opinion of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi. We're not giving fatwa on Imam Abu Hanifa's position in some rulings. We give fatwa on, for example, Imam Abu Yusuf's opinion, or Imam Muhammad's opinion, or even Imam Zufar's opinion in many places, and some places even Imam Hassan ibn Ziyad. So why is it that we are giving fatwa based on an opinion which is contrary to Imam Saab's opinion, when we are called Hanafis, followers of Imam Abu Hanifa? So therefore, you are not a follower of Imam Hanifa. You are doing something else here. You're following not just Imam Abu Hanifa, but all of these other people too. So this is a question that is posed, and Ibn Abidin mentions that this was a question that was really, irritating me for a very long time. And I didn't really find a satisfactory answer for this until I came upon this concept that the students of Imam Saab, they all mention that whatever we say was an opinion of Imam Saab. So that's the first thing that we need to understand, that it was actually an opinion of Imam Saab anyway. The second thing there is that it's come from the instruction of Imam Saab, Imam Abu Hanifa, who said to them that you go according to what you think the evidence is stronger in. So this was because it was done by the instruction of Imam Saab. So in essence, it is what Imam Saab said to do anyway. So in this way, it becomes something which Imam Saab said to do. So that's the reason why you can say, one reason why, as to his explaining, that we're still within the school. We're still within the Hanafi school when we give a ruling based on based on one of the other imams, or one of the other, so we say, students of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayh. And also he then mentions another very interesting comment from Imam Abu Hanifa, which is mentioned by many people, the likes of Ibn Shihna al-Kabir. He mentions this. Likewise, Ibn al-Humam mentions this, and many others have mentioned this from Imam Abu Hanifa. He says, this is a famous one, إذا صح الحديث فهو مذهبي. That when a hadith is correct, that this hadith is valid, it's not just valid, but it's correct, it's sahih, then that is my madhab. That is my opinion. So now some people have taken this overboard, and they've said that, oh, that means that whenever a hadith is sahih, that means that's Imam Saab's madhab then. What Imam Saab meant by this needs to be then understood. First thing that needs to be understood here is that when Imam Saab mentioned this, who was he addressing? He was addressing the people who have the capacity and capability of looking into evidences like this, who have the capacity to make understanding that, okay, this hadith is sahih, but this hadith is also sahih. Which one are we going to give preference to? So that's the first thing to understand, that he was addressing his students who had encompassive understanding of all the rulings that are there, and they knew what the abrogator was, because sometimes a hadith can be sahih in itself because of the chain of narration, whatever, that is making it correct, making it valid, making it sahih, but that is the ruling that it's containing is mansukh, is no longer acted upon, right? So just because a hadith is sahih, it doesn't necessarily mean that is the ruling that currently we follow, because that may be related to something that the Muslims in the earlier days did. But because it's come to us through a correct chain, it will make that hadith sahih. So the hadith science obviously needs to be understood within the remit of what we're talking about in regards to hadith. But when you do istikhraj, when you take out masail, derive rulings, then obviously this is a science on its own. So the first thing is understood here, that Imam Sahib was addressing his students who understood how or what can be attributed to Imam Sahib even, and what the permissions in related to this, what remit Imam Sahib was talking about this under. So there's no doubt whatsoever that if actually a hadith was valid and it was going against the school, we would go according to the hadith. We would go according to the hadith, most definitely, because obviously the hadith is what we should be following, right? Likewise, if there was a Quranic ayah which goes against the madhab, which goes against what the ruling is mentioned by the faqih, by the mujtahid even, then we would go according to that. But the reality of the matter is that there is no ruling like this. That's the understanding. Why? Because the rulings within the school have been refined, have been really, really, with a toothpick, with a comb, it has been completely refined to an extent where all the scholars, so many scholars, the likes of Ibn al-Humam, the likes of, so many different scholars, the Qasim Qutlubuha, as he's mentioning, so many, Qadi Khan, all of these scholars, they went through the madhab, they analyzed, and they had capacity, Imam Tahawi, Quduri, all of these scholars, they had the capacity, Imam Khassaf, to look at the evidences like this, and to really refine the madhab to the extent that to the level that we find it today. So are you going to find a ruling within the madhab that goes against a sahih hadith now? You won't find that. But initially, what Imam Saab meant was the address to those individuals who had the capacity to look into riwayah, to look into the evidences like this, and be able to differentiate. So that's one thing that needs to be understood. And The second thing that needs to be understood here, that sometimes when the student of Imam Sab opposes Imam Sab in a particular ruling, then why have they opposed him? That needs to be understood. Sometimes that would be based on a particular need. So we prayed before, like Ibn Abdin mentions here, that we allow now the istijara la ta'lim al-Quran, we allow to hire somebody to teach the Quran. So why is it that we allow somebody nowadays to teach the Quran, whereas that goes against the principles of the madhab, and it goes, it's not something which the ashabul madhab, the people of the madhab, the initial imams of our madhab actually mentioned permissibility for. So we see that it was because it's based on darura, upon need. So you see the difference that we've gone against Imam Sab in a certain particular scenario is not because we're opposing Imam Sab, is because there is a particular need that's come about now, which dictates for us to be giving this particular ruling now. So to conclude now this discussion that Ibn Abdin was mentioning, that the reasons why the Imam of our madhab, Imam Abu Hanifa, in essence Imam al-A'zam, will be conflicted, as we will see it, that we're not going in accordance to Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion, is because the first reason is because the mashayikh, the scholars of our madhab, who are the scholars of preponderance, or anyone higher than them, preponderated a certain opinion, and majority of them went with that. They all said, yes, this is the correct opinion that we should go with nowadays. So that's one reason that they did they went against Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion, because of this one reason, and that's why we will give preference to that. That's why that becomes part of our school. And second is that the scholars that did that, sometimes they did it based on a custom. So if there's a ruling based on a particular custom, then obviously custom has a part to play within fiqhi rulings. So where custom will dictate a certain ruling to come into play, then that ruling may come into play, because that ruling initially was based on custom. Likewise, if that ruling is based on the time period and the era, or based on a need, like we just gave an example previously of, so based on a particular need, now that need no longer applies, or a different need applies, right? The time has changed now, whereby technologies come about now, or different modes of transport have come about now. So we're going to have to now apply the modern day understanding of what our original fuqaha, our original imams mentioned. So we're applying their principles, generally speaking, their qawaid that they have mentioned, and we're applying that. So where they applied that is not necessarily them going against the school, but they are now mentioning something like this, and they did this, meaning these scholars that did this, they did this with the confidence that if the Sahibul Madhab himself, if Imam Sab was alive today, he would rule according to what we're ruling as well, because his principles we are putting into play. We can see that Imam Sab's, we're not going against Imam Sab's qawaid, his principles. We are just analogizing on some of the other rulings that Imam Sab mentioned, and we're coming up with this ruling. So this is another reason as to how these rulings then formulate. So this is all what Ibn Abdin's mentioning, but then he says that the demand of this now is that we cannot say that Imam Sab says this, because Imam Sab doesn't say that, because he doesn't explicitly mention anything about this ruling. But what you would have to say, that the most you can say in essence, is that the demand of Imam Sab's madhab is this, or what's understood from Imam Sab's principles is this, or according to the principles of Imam Sab, this is the mas'ala in this particular scenario. But you cannot say Imam Sahib would say this or Imam Sahib says this, because obviously that's a lie, because Imam Sahib doesn't say that. So you can't attribute directly to him, but you can attribute to the muqtada, basically the what we have understood from the demands of what his principles and his qawaid would be. So in accordance to the principles of Imam Sahib, this is the ruling. So that's the most that you can say. And this is why various scholars he then quotes from, saying from, like, for example, in Durar al-Ghurur, he mentions that a similar thing whereby a person, he attributes himself to the Hanafi school, it's fine, as long as it's a opinion which it doesn't contradict the Sahibul Madhab in essence, right? Likewise, in some scholars mention in the same sort of language, saying that the demand of Imam Sahib's maslak, Imam Sahib's madhab is this. So that's the way to go about tackling this particular these rulings. And when these rulings come about, it doesn't mean that we have gone against Imam Sahib here. So yeah, it will just simply be called the takhrijat of his madhab, meaning the extrapolated rulings upon Imam Sahib's madhab. You can say that as well, because it would be based upon the foundational rulings, the qawaid and usul of Imam Sahib. So that's what he concludes this discussion on. In between now, he also mentioned a very important, I would say, side ruling that you people maybe need to also understand, that there are certain scholars, the likes of Ibn al-Humam, for example, I mentioned. They were of the opinion, many others as well, they were of the opinion that wherever Imam Abu Hanifa has an opinion, you cannot give fatwa against that opinion. You have to give fatwa based on Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion. The only time you can turn away from Imam Sahib's opinion is if the evidence is weak. If his evidence is weak, then you can turn away from Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion. Otherwise, you will always have to give fatwa on Imam Sahib's opinion. You cannot give fatwa on any. So that's why where certain scholars give a fatwa based on, for example, Imam Abu Yusuf's opinion, Imam Muhammad's opinion, Imam Zufar's opinion, for example, these scholars, this group of scholars will refute them, will say, no, we don't agree with you. Yeah, you have to give fatwa based on Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion, regardless of anything else. Like, for example, in the Mithlain that we talked about, the Asr time starting after the shadow has become twice the length of the object. So here, generally speaking, especially in the Indian subcontinent, in the UK as well, we have generally the Hanafis following the opinion that it's this, the later time. So this is based on this particular opinion as well, to a degree, that we will try our best to always give fatwa on Imam Sahib's opinion unless we have a reason to move away from that. So this is a sentiment, you can say, among certain within our school, that certain scholars do hold the Imam Sahib's opinion to be, the final opinion in essence. Where maybe he doesn't have an opinion, or maybe where it's confusing, then you can maybe go towards another opinion or side with somebody else. But otherwise, you would have to give fatwa generally on Imam Sahib's opinion. So remember this is also there, meaning some scholars were of this opinion, though the majority of the Hanafi scholars were not of this opinion, that you can give fatwa, and the fatwa was allowed to be given on other opinions based on certain reasons, which we will pray later it will come about, because that's what we're trying to learn here, that why would it be given on a certain opinion. So what were the reasons for preponderance? So preponderance, reasons, and all of that will come later. So all of that we'll pray, inshallah, or we'll study. But for now, just to understand this whole discussion of various opinions coming about from a mujtahid, that it's possible that various opinions were existing for a mujtahid, which he all started the discussion against the mujtahidun for. And in between, he tackled some very interesting questions, and he tried to give some satisfactory answers as to why they were, obviously, like we said, or there is in the madhab fatwa based on opinions that are not Imam Sahib's opinion. So he's given various reasons for that. So hopefully that has all made sense to everybody. And for this session, inshallah, we will leave it there. The next session, inshallah, we will be starting more of the actual usul of iftar. This was, like I said to you, he kind of went on one, but he did obviously give us certain benefits as we went along because of the fiqhi discussions that are there. And I felt that those kind of discussions were very important to highlight, especially for a student that is studying at this particular level of fiqh. So these were the things that I felt that were important. There was just one discussion which I kind of skipped. I'll just quickly mention briefly regarding it that there is a bit of a discussion that if there was an ikhtilaf, if there was a difference of opinion earlier on in the times of the Imams or even the Sahaba or something, right? Then if later on a ijma' happens, a consensus happens afterwards, does it mean now that the ikhtilaf is gone? There's no more ikhtilaf. So remember, just as a general principle, that amongst the usuliyun, there are two opinions regarding this. Both sides are, there's an opinion for both sides, which is that the one obvious opinion is that the later ijma' will take away the ikhtilaf. There's no more ikhtilaf now. This is a mujma' alayh ruling. Okay? And the other opinion, obviously, is that no, just because of a later ijma' that happened, consensus that happened, doesn't mean that the previous ikhtilaf is no longer existent. That ruling is still a mukhtalaf fi mas'ala, meaning that ruling is still a mas'ala which can be differed upon. It's a difference of opinion regarding it. The benefit of knowing that is simply the discussion, meaning what's the thamara of that, what's the benefit of that, is that obviously if some qadi or if a mufti or somebody was to rule contrary to this later ijma', obviously according to that first group who say that the earlier ikhtilaf is no longer existent, that ruling is a consensus ruling. That mufti or that qadi has ruling against the ijma', that means. So that qadi's rule will not be implemented. That mufti's fatwa will not be taken because they've gone against the consensus. However, according to the second opinion, that the mas'ala still remains mukhtalaf fi, meaning the mas'ala still remains a mas'ala which there's difference of opinion regarding, a valid difference of opinion regarding. So then that qadi or that mufti's ruling will be implemented because it's still a mukhtalaf fi mas'ala despite the later ijma' taking place. So this is just a fiqhi discussion, I think a discussion where obviously according to certain principles, if a mufti gave a ruling, then what will happen in a particular mas'ala. So nevertheless, this is all the discussion that Ibn Abin has all over here. Hope this has been beneficial for this particular session. Inshallah, we move on into the actual, hopefully moving on to the other usul in the next lesson, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. So alhamdulillah, today we have been able to go through, mashallah, this finishing of this discussion of Ibn Abidin, where he goes against what the usuliyun mentioned regarding having multiple opinions attributed to a mujtahid. And he says, obviously Ibn Abidin proves that you can have multiple opinions attributed to a mujtahid. Through various ways he explained this. Out of all of these things, we discussed one important thing, which was that when Imam Sahib mentioned to the students that if you find a evidence to be stronger, then you can go with that, then this was based on the instruction of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayh. Likewise, the students mentioned themselves that everything we say is attributed from, is sourced from the Imam, is come from Imam Abu Hanifa himself. He once upon a time said it, though he may have retracted from it, but he definitely mentioned this. So this gives us certain understanding, and obviously also answers the question that when we are following, for example, in a ruling Imam Muhammad's opinion, then why are we still called followers of Imam Abu Hanifa when we're not following Imam Hanifa's opinion? So one reason is what we just mentioned, because it would be sourced from Imam Sahib. Second reason is because they did what they did based on Imam Sahib's instruction. So following them is in essence following Imam Sahib, because that was the instruction of Imam Sahib. Likewise, various things he mentions that he then supports this by saying إذا صح الحديث فهو مذهبي. What does that mean? That he's telling his students that if a certain hadith is correct, valid, then that's my madhab. So if the student was able to verify that, then based on that also, this would be Imam Sahib's maslak, this would be Imam Sahib's opinion anyway. But obviously remembering here that this was addressed to his students who had the capability to look into evidences like this. So we won't just go with anybody's preponderances. Like, for example, Ibn al-Humam is famous. Obviously, he is one of the muhaddithun of the Hanafi madhab. But despite that, his own student, Qasim Qutlubuha, mentions that we won't go with some of the opinions of our shaykh, meaning our teacher, Ibn al-Humam, when it contradicts the madhab. So this is something to remember, that there are some scholars, even today, that you will find to be great hadith scholars. But when it comes to going against the madhab, then they will be a bit more lenient in going against the madhab. So it doesn't mean that just because they're a big muhaddith, they are to be followed. No, we are following Imam Abu Hanifa, we are following the Hanafi madhab, following the Hanafi school. So you have to stick to the madhab. The madhab is very clear in certain rulings. So if a person has their own opinion regarding something, that's no problem. We will consider that to be their single standalone opinion. That will be their tafarrud in essence. So we will not go and give fatwa based on that, nor will we do amal and practice upon that. Though in respect of that person, we won't stand up against them perhaps, especially if that person is respectful and understands, hopefully, which they do, understands the remit of ikhtilaf. So this is this discussion, inshallah. And we also concluded a few other points, the main points we've discussed now, inshallah.